Hello, and welcome to this edition of People in Transition. I'm your host, Bob Gerst. I've been hiring and mentoring executives, frontline employees, and job seekers for nearly 40 years through a host of transitions, some difficult, but most very good. This experience has given me a bird's eye view on a variety of trends, economies, industry disruptors, and transitions, big and small. It also brought me into contact with the thought leaders and decision makers you need to meet. Imagine knowing exactly what to do next and how to know it's time to make your big job change. We all know transitions can be scary, but it doesn't have to be. And it's even fun when you have actionable strategies and proven tactics to achieve the future you want. We'll share with you the tools and skills that can take your dreams to your next great job. So if change is on your horizon, you won't want to miss this discussion. Also, please subscribe to this podcast so you won't miss any future episodes. Scott Maderer, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of People in Transition. Ever since we first started chatting on LinkedIn, I've been excited about the opportunity of our getting together. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm honored to be here and hope that we can have a great show and give some value to your listeners out there.
Scott, one of the questions that I always ask each of my guests, I'm curious about it, and I think my listeners are as well, is when you were a young child, what was it that you saw yourself doing when you grew up?
You know, I'm one of those kids that I probably had a lot of different ideas, but I was sure I wanted to do something around science. I actually went down the road of going to be a doctor, that kind of thing. I wasn't sure what it was going to look like, but something around medicine or science. At the same time, I was always an entrepreneurial kid, so I actually started my first business when I was 12, and no, it was not a doctor business. I was painting houses. So I kind of had both of those things going on at the same time. Wanted to be a doctor and had entrepreneurial mindsets as well.
And Scott, what were the transition moments that you experienced from that time as a child that you wanted to be a science/entrepreneur to where you're at today?
So I have a number of transitions in my life. I started out, I went to college. I actually have a degree in biochemistry. I have a degree in genetics. Again, I was going to go down that idea of medical researcher. And I actually did medical research for a little while and figured out I hated it. So I transitioned and said, well, what else can I do with a science degree? I can become a school teacher. So I became a science teacher. I did that for 16 years. I taught middle school. I taught high school. I've taught every science class that they offer in the state of Texas. I burned out on that. It's very exhausting to be a school teacher. I went into the corporate world. I worked myself up to senior kind of executive leadership position. I did that for 11 years. And then that entrepreneurial bug came back and I started my own business on the side and eventually transitioned to running my own coaching business. And that's what I do today.
And Scott, you've been a part of a number of different transitions throughout your career. I guess kind of a two-part question. Any of them, do you think, helped you to be qualified to discuss transitions? And then the second part to that is, did you do your transitions well?
So the first part, what qualifies me, I think it does. Simply, I've went through them, which automatically gives you some level of experience. But beyond that, even when I was in senior management, sometimes I was actually helping other people transition either into the job or out of the job, because I was in a position where I was the leader for leaders. So I ended up with about 180 people that kind of reported up through me in the company. So there was a lot of transition that wasn't mine that I still got involved in the discussions and conversations and seeing what went. And that kind of led me to begin seeing what was successful in transitions. So for the most part, most of the transitions I've made have been successful. I did have one where I was doing medical research and they let me go kind of thing, as opposed to me choosing to transition. But all of the rest of them have been ones that I've kind of had the timing and the ability to do it on my own terms.
Before I start my transition, how can I find out where my own strengths and weaknesses are at so that I can be aware and potentially discuss them?
One of the best exercises that I've done, and I do this with some of the folks that I work with, is kind of a twofold process. One is looking backwards and the other is looking forward. So the looking backward part means sitting down and thinking about all of the stuff that you've done, not just jobs, not just things you've been paid to do, but different areas of your life, different things that you do and begin to kind of dump out or brainstorm, what about these do I love? What about these do I not love? What am I so good at that I almost don't think it's important because it comes so easy to me? What do I struggle with? Where do I get challenged? Where have I had success? Where have I had failure? Just kind of almost a data dump of what have you done up till now? And then the flip of that is to begin to look into the future. And so one of the ways I ask people to frame that question is what I call the airport question, which is imagine for a minute that you were walking through an airport and you just found out your plane has been delayed. You're going to sit there for the next 4 or 5 hours and you run into an old friend that you haven't seen for 5 years. And that friend says to you, "Hey, how are you doing, Bob? It's so great to catch up. What's been going on these last 5 years?" And as y'all sit down together to get a drink and have something to eat, you say, "This has been the best 5 years of my life because." And the idea is fill in what comes after that word because. What would make the 5 years that you've just lived the best 5 years of your life? So one of them is you're looking backwards. The other, you're looking forward and kind of dreaming, what would the next 5 years look like if they're the best 5 years of my life? And between those two, you often get a pretty good sense of where your strengths lie, where your skills lie, and where your dreams lie.
I've heard before someone do an exercise similar to that. A additional step that they add on is to share that with a trusted friend, family member, someone that they really believe can give them candid feedback about that picture that we've painted. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Especially if you've got a partner or spouse, someone who's heavily involved in that decision, you want to involve them in the conversation. In part, I kind of do it as if it's a solo because I don't know if the person's in that situation, but it's always good to get other input and hear other voices. I've actually had other people complete that exercise for someone. So in other words, Bob, here's this exercise that I've been asked to do. I'm going to go do it, but why don't you do it and pretend like you're me? What would you see about me? What would you add about me? So not even just handing someone what I've done and asking them to check over the work, but almost asking them to answer on my behalf, especially if it's a dear friend or a spouse or someone who knows you really deeply. That can oftentimes lead to conversations that go a little deeper about why did you see that? Why did you not see this? And where did that come from? And may open your eyes to some things that you were blind to.
Scott, what happens if you think that you have the proverbial golden handcuffs and that you can't afford to transition out of the job? How do you coach clients that have that perspective?
So that's actually a big part of a lot of the folks that come to me is the financial area is a struggle. I don't have enough money to do what I want to do, or I can't afford to do what I want to do. And a lot of times that feeling comes from a lack of actually being able to see the real financial picture. A lot of times we have these ideas in our heads that, this is how much I make, this is how much I spend, but it's just kind of these vague numbers. And so it's a matter of sitting down and again, getting a really transparent, real look of what do you have coming in? What do you have going out? And then beginning to align that with your real values and priorities. I always talk about spending plans or budgets, if you want to use that term, is it's more important to focus on what you want to say yes to than what it is you want to say no to. Because if, for instance, you want to say yes to a job transition, there may be things that you need to say no to for a while so that you can save up money and have a runway, have some reserves, have something set back. But a lot of times we feel like that's deprivation. We feel like that's, sacrifice until you have a big enough why and reason to say yes to things. And then that lets you do it without really even feeling any pain because you're saying yes to something bigger.
Yeah, I would assume you had to go through that feeling and that exercise as you stepped off your corporate world into your own business.
Absolutely. I went from making mid six figures to not making mid six figures. My first year in business, I did not make $100,000. I'll tell you that right now. But it's that idea of being able to prepare a plan and have the runway, be financially set. My wife and I are not bazillionaires. We don't live high on the hog, but at the same time, we put things in place where we could make that transition and not have to worry about the lights being shut off and not have to worry about going hungry. And those are really the important things.
Scott, how does understanding your own mindset and your own personality, how does that help you make the transition effectively?
So a lot of times, I think we kind of overcomplicate things a little bit in terms of mindset and personality. I love the DISC model, which is DISC, it's DISC, but they each stand for something simply because it's easy to understand. But what it boils down to is some of us are kind of high driver result people. Some of us are kind of more driven by fun or entertainment. Some of us tend to have a feeling of safety, security, status quo is kind of important to us. And some of us like rules and rhythm and routine and structure and doing the right thing the right way. All four of those folks can make transitions successfully. All four of them will have certain fears, certain expectations, certain things that they want in place before they transition. All four of them are different in terms of what they want. And so getting some understanding about how you're wired, and then again, if you're in a relationship, how your partner is wired, allows you to begin to have some conversations around what do we need to make sure we're putting in place so that we both feel good about this change and it doesn't end up causing fear or stress or anxiety that isn't necessary. You're going to have some of that anyway, so let's at least get rid of everything that we can get rid of, and so that you're just dealing with the regular transition, not a bunch of extra stuff.
Scott, give me your thoughts on how to transition effectively from a job that you really dislike, maybe even hate, to a calling of love for your job.
So a lot of that goes back to that exercise we talked about earlier, and that dream part of that exercise where you really get in touch with, what do I want to be when I grow up? What is it? Because people a lot of times have these vague ideas. I want to have lifestyle freedom. Okay, great. What does lifestyle freedom mean to you? What does that look like? What does it mean you actually do? And when you get up in the morning, when you go to bed at night, what happened during the day? What happened between getting up and going to bed? What does it really look like? The better you can paint that picture of what it is you think you would love. And by the way, the cool thing is you're going to make a plan, you're going to paint a picture, and let me tell you up front, it's wrong. But that's actually good. It's not a bad thing. We think, we have to have all the details nailed down and know everything perfectly to be able to make any steps or any changes. What I'm saying is create a dream, but then hold it with a really open hand and begin to move towards it in a way that you also can, as you get new information, as you get new understanding, as you get new clarity, maybe you make some changes or shifts. You're not holding it with a tight fist. A lot of times when we're in a position that we hate, when we're in that thing that we really don't like doing, we're so focused on how much we hate it that we want to run away from that, as opposed to first figure out where you want to go and then move towards it. There's a big difference between going towards something you want and running away from something that you hate.
Let's say that you have a partner, a spouse, and you're planning a transition. What should you do to help get on the same page with your partner about that transition?
The first and most important step is actually talk to them, actually communicate, actually sit down and have some regular times to brainstorm and dream together and talk about what this would look like. To also ask questions and ask them, what are they afraid of about this? What are they excited about when it comes to a transition? What are they seeing, like we talked about earlier, involving them in the dreaming and the picture casting and the vision casting around this. And then I think part of it too is making sure that whatever transition or dream you put in place, you're not putting your partner on the other side of it. What I mean by that is you want to both stand on the same side and be going the same direction so that you're pushing towards the dream together. I see a lot of times we have it in our head that we need to make this transition. And because maybe our partner has some fears or some worries or some anxieties, we decide that it means our partner is against us. They don't want us to make this transition. They don't want me to be happy. They don't want me to make this change. That's usually not what it is. They love you. They care for you. They actually want you to be safe and protected. They're trying to help. But it ends up a lot of times putting us on opposite sides of the transition or the dream. And then we're pushing against each other as opposed to working together. So that's why it's so important that you do that dream together and agree that this is the direction we're going to go, and then have regular check-ins and communication, because again, it's going to change as you go. It's not going to look exactly the way you thought it was going to look when you started. So if you aren't checking in and talking constantly, then you end up drifting apart.
We talked on this before, and I think this is a big one. When you're making a transition, how do you recognize the difference between being busy and being productive with the things that you're working on?
A lot of times, especially this happens in situations where someone is let go and they've now had a transition that wasn't of their own choice. They'll fill their day with stuff that may seem like it's helping them. I'm going to fine tune my resume for the 14th time. I'm going to maybe go out and brainstorm on new ideas. But sometimes you need to actually focus in on what is it that's going to move the needle. In this case, what's going to move you in a direction that moves you towards the things that you really want to be doing. Is it putting a resume in for a new job? Is it starting a business? Okay, great. Whatever it is, what's the next action that I need to take? The question that I always try to ask that helps focus on productivity as opposed to just busyness is, what's the next smallest action I could take that actually moves me in the direction that I need to go? Because a lot of times instead we're just focusing on filling our days with stuff as opposed to filling our days with stuff that actually moves the needle for us.
I coach people that don't always shoot for perfection, shoot for action.
Done is actually better than perfect. The phrase I use is progress, not perfect, which technically grammatically should be progress, not perfection, but I deliberately don't say it grammatically correct because it should be progress, not perfect.
How can you build your self-confidence during your job search?
That is a hard one, especially, again, if you were let go, you didn't want to leave, but you've been told to leave. That can be a really big blow to our confidence because a lot of times we equate what we do with who we are. And I think that's kind of the most important step, is to recognize and do some work on figuring out, who are you really? What is the underlying calling that you have or direction that you have? I believe in a higher power, so I would call it a calling from a higher power, but whatever language you want to use, what is that core thing that you're really meant to do? Because the truth is, the career or the jobs or the businesses you have, those are assignments. They're temporary. They're not permanent. Your calling or your drive or what you're meant to do shows up in different ways in those assignments. And so when you get clear on that and you recognize that who you are is deeper and bigger and more connected than just whatever assignment you had, it gets a little easier to step back and go, you know what? I am worth something. Yeah, right now I'm unemployed, but that doesn't make me worthless. That just means I need to maybe find a new way of bringing in some income.
Let's shift gears for just a moment and talk about networking. I know that you're a big believer in terms of the power of networking. How do you coach your clients to network with someone that they don't know? And kind of a follow-up question is, how can you just make networking a more pleasant experience?
Especially for those of us that are introverts, networking is never really, quote, pleasant, but you can learn to make it more comfortable. And part of that is, again, keep the end in mind. Why are you wanting to have these conversations with folks? What are you hoping to get out of it? But then also flip the script and say, what is it that I can help them with? What is it that they can get out of this conversation? So I usually go into a networking situation, even if I'm the one that actually ultimately needs something, with the question, what can I do to help you? What can I do that would make your life easier? What can I do to help you? And to do that, you just go into the conversation with curiosity. Bob, tell me about yourself. Tell me what's going on. Tell me about your business. Tell me about your family. Tell me about your hobbies. Now, you don't want to sound like you're giving an interrogation. I'm running all of these together. The truth is, you'd be having a conversation and there'd be give and take in it. But if you keep yourself focused on them, people naturally will begin to ask you questions about you most of the time. And that's where then you have an opportunity to talk about you and talk about what you need going on or what would help you. And I've learned a lot of times one of the most important questions to ask people is simply, who do you know that I need to know? Who do you know that I need to know? Allows them to have an opportunity to introduce you to someone else who often is an even better connection or another better step up. I've done that a lot of times where I'm looking for a particular job and I may not know somebody in that industry or in that field, but I'll reach out to all the people I do know. And after we've had the conversation and gotten to know each other a little bit, I can ask them, I can tell them who I'm looking for or what kind of contact I'm looking for. And who do you know that I need to know? And usually within 2 or 3 conversations, I've got an introduction to the exact kind of person that I actually was trying to have a conversation with in the first place. And often that opens the door to then the need that I actually needed. But I do it by not coming in with, hey, help me. I do it with coming in with, how can I help you?
Scott, what have you seen or experienced yourself that has worked most well in being successful in finding that next job faster, easier? And then the flip side of that coin, what have you seen that hasn't worked as well?
So let me start with the hasn't worked as well, and then I'll talk about what does. I think especially in today's world, there's a lot of tendency to let me just fill out the resume online or put my resume up on Monster or LinkedIn or whatever service is out there, and I'll just wait for the calls. I'll just wait for people to come to me. That doesn't work as well as I wish it would for most people in most situations. It doesn't tend to get you as many calls back or get you that next opportunity. The same thing happens if you're trying to start your own activity or start your own business. People will, I'll just hang up a shingle and the clients will come. Yeah, clients don't usually magically fall out of the sky. That's not how that works. And that leads to what helps us and what makes us most successful is really, it's about intentional action. It's about, again, having that picture in mind of where you want to go, what do you want it to look like, how do I want to get there? And then what's the next little action I can take? And then taking those actions and doing it consistently. That doesn't mean get up one day and make 5 calls and then sit around for the next 3 days hoping someone calls you back. It means how many calls can you make today? Make twice that many tomorrow. Or how many contacts can I make? How many people can I go have a conversation with? What can I do? What's the activity that I need to do? And then trying to do that to the maximum consistent level that you can. That consistency leads to more success than almost anything else.
Scott, do manners still count during your job search?
Of course they do. Manners count. Being polite counts. Being direct counts. Communicating well. All of those things that we think of as just the niceties. Basically, anything that you would need to do to be successful in that new place that you want to be, you need to almost be exhibiting it before you get there. I used to tell this to people in the corporate world that were looking for a promotion. I'm like, one of the best ways to get a promotion is almost do the job that you want to be promoted to before they've promoted you. And then it's almost a no-brainer to give you the title and the position and everything else because you've already proven you can do it. Now, you may not be able to do everything that's in the job, but the same thing happens when we're interviewing or when we're looking for those things. If people expect you to have the ability to communicate well, you need to exhibit that you have the ability to communicate well. And that would include manners, politeness, following up. One of the worst things I've seen people do is they'll go for something like a job interview and then they don't send a note or a follow-up, even an email is better than nothing, saying, thank you for interviewing me today. I appreciated your time. I appreciated getting to know a little bit about your company. I'm really looking forward to learning more and going forward with that position. That's polite, but it's also smart from a job search perspective in that you've kept that line of communication going and you've shown that you have the willingness and the ability to follow up.
I read somewheres that 80% of hiring managers say that thank you notes are a positive action, yet less than 24% of candidates send them. You can help stand out just by doing that.
It's a small thing, but it's not. I've been a hiring manager. I can tell you those stats are not far off, in my experience as well. I very seldom got a thank you note. And every time I did, it was like, I need to take another look at this person. Even if I wasn't going to hire him initially, I'm taking a second look because that already showed something that's different and unusual and unexpected and welcome.
Scott, what do you think are the lessons the candidate can get out of the setbacks and the victories that they experience during their job search?
That's a very broad question. And so the short answer is it depends, right? Because it depends on what setbacks and victories that you have. But at the same time, in general, I think what we can take from it, and the part that maybe I think people struggle with is a lot of times we personalize setbacks and then we almost push victories off on other people. So we'll say, well, I didn't get that job. I must have interviewed terribly. It's all my fault. Kind of almost making it a victim sort of mentality. And yet when something good happens, it's like, well, that was just luck. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you aren't responsible for your own activities and you shouldn't do a better job if maybe you're not interviewing well and that kind of thing, and you can't get better at those skills and all of that. No, absolutely, you can improve and do better. But a lot of times even when we did well, we take it personally when it may actually not be personal at all. It may just be there was another candidate that had 7 years of experience and you only had 4, or something else that has nothing to do with anything that you can, quote, change. So it's not personalizing the setbacks while at the same time not pushing away on the victories. Acknowledge the victories, acknowledge the wins, repeat those, pay attention to those, and recognize that they mean you're doing something right. And also with the setbacks, make sure, is this something I need to learn from and I need to change? Like not sending a thank you note. Maybe I could start doing that. Or is this just probably the vagaries of the business? And that's where a lot of times having someone else outside of you, whether that's your partner, your spouse, a coach, somebody else helping you, that can help with that, because a lot of times they can see from outside and go, well, I noticed this pattern. That's consistent. We need to fix that. But this other thing, that's just the luck of the draw. Get over it and move on. Don't dwell on that one.
Scott, any thoughts on job search groups, and could they help you, again, finding that next great job?
Any resource that you have available to you can help you, whether that's networking with people you know, whether that's reaching out to people and making connections through other friends or through church or through other groups that you're part of, job search groups, those sorts of things. And by the way, this is where sometimes hiring a career coach or somebody that helps with job transitions or somebody that helps people do these sorts of things can be valuable. So it's not don't use those resources. What I would say, though, is no matter what resource you're using, you can't abdicate the responsibility fully to someone else. You still have to own the process. You still have to take ownership and responsibility for what you're going out there and doing and how you're showing up and all of those sorts of things.
Scott, any books or other resources that you would recommend to someone who's in transition?
So one of the authors that I've followed for a number of years, he's actually written the foreword for a book that I have coming out next year, is Dan Miller. And he's written 48 Days to the Work You Love. He's written No More Mondays. Both of those are good books to read if you're kind of in those early stages of thinking about a transition or wanting to make a transition. I wouldn't put either one of those in the, I just lost my job and I need a job next week category. But if you're one of those folks that you're in a thing and you know it's not right for you and you know that you're going to want to make a transition and you're starting to try to wrap your head around what that looks like, I would recommend either one of those books.
Scott, if our listeners remember 3 things about being effective in a job search, what are the 3 things that you want them to keep in mind?
So number one, kind of harking back to what we talked about very early on, is get clear on a picture of what you want your next thing to look like as quickly as you can. Get that dream picture in mind. The second thing is focus on intentionally moving in that direction. The intentional is the key part, not randomly. Do consistent, intentional action that will move you forward, and make sure that you stay connected to the people around you that are important to you, that can support you, your cheerleader squad, your spouse, those sorts of folks, the folks that will lift you up and give you honest feedback. They'll tell you if you're screwing up, but then they're going to put their arm around you and say, and I still love you, and hold you up and kind of walk you forward, because you need that support crew to be able to make a transition well.
I love that counsel. It's decide which path you want to take and then commit to it. I think that's good advice. Scott, thank you so much from all of my listeners on your thoughts, on your ideas, on your challenges that you presented them with. They're going to be better job seekers because of your thoughts. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for listening. We're working in unprecedented times. The purpose of these episodes is to give you the support and critical tools to adjust with the changing marketplace. I'll continue to introduce you to guests who have successfully survived their own obstacle course and can share useful information. If today's message was helpful to you, please share it on your social media. Your review and rating helps get this to more people. Also, if you have questions or podcast ideas for future conversations, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Change is constant. The more prepared you are for it, the better and easier the change will occur. Thank you again. This is your host, Bob Gerst. See you at our next episode.